Welcome to Explain Movie, where movies are more than just entertainment. Every frame hides a clue, every scene carries a deeper meaning, and every story holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. From explosive blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to chilling horror, dark thrillers, and forgotten cinematic gems, we go beyond the surface to reveal hidden details, shocking fan theories, clever Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that most viewers never notice. Because the greatest mysteries in cinema aren't always hiding in plain sight. This isn't just watching movies, it's discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Explain Movie and experience cinema like never before. Although Assassins wasn't one of Stallone's biggest box office hits, the role showed his willingness to grow as an actor. Looking back, the character reads almost like an early sketch of themes he'd return to later in films like Copland, Rocky Balboa, Creed, and the 2008 Rambo. Rat is, at his core, an aging warrior coming to terms with his own mortality, a theme Stallone would keep circling back to for the rest of his career. Opposite Stallone is Antonio Banderas as Miguel Bain, one of the most memorable villains of the decade. At the time, Banderas was still fairly new to American audiences. Born in Spain, he first made a name for himself through his work with acclaimed filmmaker Pedro Almodovar. Films like Labyrinth of Passion, Matador, Law of Desire, and Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown established him as one of Spain's most exciting young actors. His move to Hollywood began in the early 1990s with films such as The Mambo Kings, Philadelphia, and Interview with the Vampire. Still, Assassins was one of his first real shots at a lead role in a big Hollywood action film. Banderas ran with the opportunity. Miguel Bain is the complete opposite of Robert Rat, where Rat is calm and disciplined. Bain is energetic, reckless, and almost childlike in his excitement. Banderas gave the character a kind of manic unpredictability that made him both entertaining and genuinely dangerous. His performance constantly walks the line between humor and menace, creating a villain who seems to enjoy the game of assassination far more than any actual payoff. Even critics who were lukewarm on the film overall tended to praise Banderas for stealing nearly every scene he was in. His energetic take introduced audiences to a different kind of action villain, one who leaned on charisma and psychological manipulation just as much as physical intimidation. The role raised his profile considerably and helped set up later leading roles in Desperado, The Mask of Zorro, The 13th Warrior, Spy Kids, and Once Upon a Time in Mexico. Another key member of the cast is Julianne Moore, who played Elektra, a computer expert caught between Rat and Bain. In 1995, Moore was still early in what would become one of the most respected careers in modern film. She'd already turned heads with performances in Short Cuts and Vanya on 42nd Street, but hadn't yet become the award-winning star audiences know today. Elektra works as both a target and an emotional anchor for Rat. Moore brought intelligence, vulnerability, and determination to the role, keeping the character from ever slipping into damsel in distress territory. Even within the confines of a fairly traditional action thriller, she manages to create a believable, sympathetic person who genuinely matters to the story. That same year, Moore also appeared in Safe, a performance many critics still consider one of the best of her career. In the decades that followed, she'd go on to build an extraordinary filmography: Boogie Nights, Magnolia, Hannibal, The Hours, Far From Heaven, Children of Men, The Kids Are All Right, and Still Alice, which finally earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress. The supporting cast also pulls its weight. Actors like Anatoly Davidov, Muse Watson, Steve Kahn, and Kelly Rowan help flesh out the world around the central conflict. Their screen time is limited next to the three leads, but they add real narrative support and help sell the film's international atmosphere. One of the more interesting things about Assassins is the chemistry among its three central performers. Stallone, Banderas, and Moore bring three very different acting styles to the table. Stallone offers classic American action star gravitas. Banderas brings explosive energy and theatrical flair, and Moore contributes emotional realism and grounded humanity. Together, they elevate the material well past a standard cat-and-mouse thriller. Assassins hit theaters in October 1995, during a fascinating moment in Hollywood history. The action genre was in the middle of a shift. The larger-than-life heroes who dominated the 1980s were still popular, but audiences were starting to embrace psychologically complex thrillers and the morally ambiguous protagonists. The film landed right at the intersection of those two trends, blending traditional action spectacle with themes of isolation, identity, and professional obsolescence. Assassins never became a cultural phenomenon on the scale of the era's biggest blockbusters, but its place in the evolution of action cinema still makes it worth examining. The mid-1990s were a transitional period for action films. Throughout the previous decade, audiences had grown used to clear-cut heroes and villains as the kind of moral certainty stars like Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger typically represented. Assassins, by contrast, introduced a protagonist who was neither hero nor villain in the traditional sense. Robert Wright is a professional killer, but he's also a man wrestling with regret, loneliness, and moral exhaustion. That complexity reflected changing tastes. The rise of psychological thrillers in the early 90s, films like The Silence of the Lambs, Basic Instinct, and 7A had already shown that audiences wanted more complicated characters and darker themes. Assassins tried to merge that psychological depth with the established conventions of the action genre, becoming part of a broader push toward more mature action storytelling. One of the film's biggest contributions was its portrayal of the aging action hero. Robert Wright isn't a young man chasing glory or adventure, he's a veteran assassin questioning his purpose and thinking about retirement. This idea would grow more central to action cinema in the decades that followed. Later films like Unforgiven, Logan, The Equalizer, John Wick, and even Stallone's own Rocky Balboa would explore similar territory, experienced fighters facing the consequences of their past. At the time, this was an unusual approach for a major studio action film. Most action heroes were still presented as essentially invincible. Wright's vulnerability, self-doubt, and emotional fatigue got ahead of trends that would become far more common in the 21st century. In many ways, the character can be seen as an early version of the reflective action protagonist that would later become a genre staple. The film also matters because of Antonio Banderas' performance as Miguel Bain. Hollywood in the 1990s was becoming increasingly international. Audiences were embracing actors from a wider range of cultural backgrounds, and studios wanted performers who could appeal globally. Banderas embodied that shift. His portrayal of Bane introduced many American viewers to his distinctive screen presence. Rather than playing a cold, calculating assassin, Banderas created a villain who was energetic, emotional, and highly theatrical, challenging a lot of the conventions tied to action movie antagonists. His constant talking, exaggerated confidence, and unpredictable behavior made him stand out in a decade already full of colorful villains, and his success helped prove that international actors could become major stars in American action films, a trend that would only grow through the late 90s and into the 2000s. Another way Assassins reflected the culture of its time was through its use of technology. The mid-1990s were a period of rapid tech growth. Personal computers, digital communication, and internet connectivity were all becoming everyday parts of life. Elektra's character operates within that emerging landscape, and much of the plot revolves around electronic surveillance, data transfers, and digital information. Some of the technology depicted now looks dated, but it captured real anxieties audiences had at the time about the growing role of computers in daily life. Assassins was part of a broader cultural conversation happening across film about technology, information, and global connectivity. The film also reflected changing ideas about globalization. Its story moves across international locations and centers on characters operating within a worldwide criminal network, mirroring real developments of the 1990s, when the end of the Cold War brought a dramatic expansion in international business, communication, and travel. Movies of the era often responded with stories that had global stakes and multinational settings. From a broader career standpoint, Assassins also occupies an interesting spot in Sylvester Stallone's filmography. By 1995, plenty of critics and audiences were wondering whether traditional action stars could stay relevant as the entertainment landscape shifted. The film became part of a larger conversation about where the action genre and its biggest icons were headed. Even though it didn't match the commercial success of some of Stallone's earlier work, it showed he was willing to experiment with different kinds of characters, and that willingness ultimately helped him stay relevant across several decades. In hindsight, Assassins looks like one step in a much longer arc that kept Stallone's career alive and evolving. The film's screenplay also holds a unique place in Hollywood history. Early drafts were written by Lana Wachowski and Lily Wachowski, years before they became internationally famous for creating The Matrix. The making of Assassins is nearly as interesting as the story on screen. Released in 1995, it brought together an impressive collection of talent both in front of and behind the camera. Between its high-profile cast and experienced director, the project was clearly meant to be a major studio effort capable of competing with the year's biggest films. But getting from script to screen wasn't smooth. It involved creative disagreements, extensive rewrites, tough action sequences, and the collaboration of filmmakers with very different artistic visions. One of the most fascinating parts of the film's history is its screenplay. The original draft came from Lana Wachowski and Lily Wachowski, long before they'd achieved worldwide fame as the creators of The Matrix. At the time, the two writers were relatively unknown in Hollywood, but their script drew real attention for its unusual take on the assassin genre and its focus on psychological conflict between protagonist and antagonist. The screenplay went through significant revision after producer Joel Silver, one of Hollywood's most successful action producers, acquired the project and began shaping it into a major studio production. Silver had already made his name through films like Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, Predator, and Demolition Man, and was one of the most influential action producers of the 80s and 90s. As development continued, the screenplay changed considerably. Veteran screenwriter Brian Helgeland came on board to handle rewrites. He'd later become known for LA Confidential, Mystic River, and A Knight's Tale. Those extensive changes created tension over who deserved credit for the screenplay, and the Wachowskis were reportedly unhappy with how much their original work had been altered. It became one of the more talked about screenwriting disputes of the decade and remains a notable chapter in Hollywood development history. Directing the film was Richard Donner, a filmmaker whose career spanned several decades. Donner was already a legend by the time Assassins entered production. Having directed The Omen, Superman, The Goonies, Scrooged, and the hugely successful Lethal Weapon series. His knack for balancing action, humor, suspense, and character work made him one of the industry's most respected directors. Donner approached Assassins wanting to create a thriller that focused as much on character relationships as on action, particularly the psychological rivalry between Robert Traut and Miguel Bain. Rather than treating it as a simple chase movie, he leaned into the emotional and philosophical differences between the two assassins, an approach that set the film apart from a lot of its competitors. Casting was one of the production's biggest strengths. Sylvester Stallone was brought on to play Robert Traut, giving the project instant star power. Stallone was one of the biggest action stars in the world at the time, but this role gave him the chance to play someone far more reflective and vulnerable than audiences typically associated with him. By various accounts, Stallone was deeply involved in developing the character, working closely with Donner to emphasize Traut's weariness and emotional isolation rather than falling back on a conventional action hero mold. He wanted to portray a man who'd spent years living with the consequences of violence. Antonio Banderas was cast as Miguel Bain, and his casting significantly changed the film's energy. He approached the role with real enthusiasm and creativity, reportedly embracing the character's eccentricities and adding many of the mannerisms and vocal choices that made Bane so memorable. Donner encouraged him to experiment, letting him build a villain who felt unpredictable and one-of-a-kind. Crew members often recall the contrast between Stallone's calm professionalism and Banderas' explosive energy, a dynamic that mirrored the characters themselves and clearly came through on screen. Many scenes benefited from the natural contrast in their acting styles, giving the rivalry a sense of authenticity. Julianne Moore joined as Elektra, a role that required balancing vulnerability with intelligence and resolve. At the time, she was quickly building a reputation as one of Hollywood's most talented actresses, and even though the part could easily have become a conventional supporting role, Moore worked to give Elektra real depth and emotional credibility. Filming took place across several locations chosen to support the story's international feel. The production made use of urban environments, office buildings, hotels, apartments, and city streets to build a world where assassins could move almost invisibly among ordinary people. Many scenes were carefully staged to emphasize surveillance, observation, and the constant sense that someone was watching. One of Donner's key visual goals was creating tension through geography and space. He wanted audiences to always understand where characters stood in relation to one another, which required careful staging, blocking, and editing. Unlike a lot of modern action films that lean on rapid cutting, Assassins often let scenes play out with a clear sense of physical space. The action sequences demanded a lot of preparation. Several scenes involve firearms, explosions, vehicle work, and practical stunts. Computer-generated effects were becoming more common by the mid-1990s, but filmmakers still relied heavily on practical techniques. So much of the film's action was achieved through traditional stunt coordination rather than digital enhancement. The production team also worked closely with weapons specialists to make sure the handling of firearms looked convincing, and because the story centers on professional assassins, real attention went into weapon selection, tactical movement, and shooting technique, all of which added authenticity that appealed to fans of crime thrillers. Assassins presents a deceptively simple premise that gradually turns into a tense psychological thriller built around obsession, professional rivalry, and redemption. At its core, it's the story of two assassins locked in a deadly competition. But underneath the action is a character-driven narrative about a man trying to escape a life of violence while another man desperately chases validation through murder. The story follows a classic cat-and-mouse structure, using suspense, shifting power dynamics, and emotional growth to keep audiences engaged from start to finish. The film opens by introducing Robert Wright, a legendary professional assassin whose reputation has made him one of the most feared killers alive. Unlike most action heroes, Wright doesn't come across as energetic or enthusiastic. He seems weary and emotionally spent. Years of carrying out assignments have left him isolated and disconnected from ordinary life. Early scenes make clear that he no longer finds satisfaction in his work and has started questioning whether he even wants to keep living this way. This opening does a lot of narrative work. First, it immediately separates Wright from traditional action protagonists who thrive on danger. Second, it sets up the film's central emotional conflict. Wright isn't just trying to survive external threats, he's dealing with an internal crisis. From the beginning, audiences understand that he wants more than success in his profession. He wants out. The story's inciting incident hits when Wright accepts what he intends to be one of his final jobs. During the operation, things go sideways, and another assassin shows up. Miguel Bane, a younger, far more reckless killer who's become obsessed with replacing Wright as the world's greatest assassin. Bane believes killing Wright will prove his own superiority and cement his reputation. This moment kicks off the film's central conflict. Instead of focusing purely on completing individual contracts, the story turns into a personal battle between two men who represent very different philosophies. Wright sees killing as a burden he wants to leave behind. Bane sees it as a source of excitement, identity, and fulfillment. Their standoff drives the rest of the narrative. One of the more effective parts of the film's structure is how gradually it reveals Bane's obsession. At first, he seems like just another assassin competing for contracts, but as the story unfolds, it becomes clear his real target is Rat himself. Bane is fascinated by Rat's legendary status and sees him as both rival and role model, a psychological layer that lifts the conflict well above a standard action movie rivalry. The first major turning point comes when Rat realizes he's being hunted. Up to that point, he's assumed he's still in control of his professional world. Bane's emergence forces him to recognize that he's become the target, a reversal that shifts the whole dynamic and ramps up tension, since the hunter has become the hunted. As the story continues, a second narrative thread develops through Elektra, a computer expert caught up in a dangerous information exchange that draws the attention of both assassins. She serves multiple functions. Practically, she becomes a central objective around which several plot threads revolve emotionally. She gives Rat a chance to reconnect with his own humanity. His relationship with her develops gradually. Unlike a lot of action films that rush romantic subplots, Assassins builds trust slowly. Rat initially sees Elektra as part of an assignment, but over time he becomes genuinely concerned for her safety. Their scenes together reveal sides of Rat that never surface in his confrontations with Bane, his compassion, vulnerability, and quiet desire for a different life. The middle stretch of the film leans heavily on escalating suspense rather than continuous action, alternating between pursuit, surveillance, preparation, and confrontation to let tension build steadily. Both Rat and Bane spend much of the film trying to anticipate each other's next move, turning the story into as much of a strategic battle as a physical one. One particularly effective device is the use of parallel character development. While Rat moves toward redemption and self-awareness, Bane sinks deeper into obsession, as their arcs function as mirror images. Rat is trying to escape violence, Bane is embracing it completely. As the story progresses, that contrast becomes more and more pronounced. Another turning point arrives when Bane's fixation on Rat starts interfering with his professional judgment. What began as a desire to surpass a legendary assassin turns into something deeply personal, and Bane starts taking bigger risks and making more reckless choices, a shift that raises the stakes because his unpredictability makes him even more dangerous. The narrative also benefits from a real sense of uncertainty throughout. Neither Rat nor Bane has the full picture at any given moment. Rat doesn't always know Bane's location or intentions, Bane frequently misreads Rat's motivations, and Elektra often lacks knowledge of the larger conflict swirling around her. That uneven distribution of information keeps viewers actively trying to guess what happens next. As the climax nears, the story narrows its focus, with the various subplots gradually converging into a final showdown between Rat and Bane. By this point, the conflict has grown well beyond professional competition into a clash between opposing worldviews. The climax works as both a physical and emotional resolution on the surface, a classic assassin versus assassin showdown, but underneath, a culmination of the film's core themes. Rat has to finally confront the violent world he's spent years living in, while Bane has to face the consequences of building his entire identity around destruction and competition. Beneath its action thriller surface, Assassins explores a surprisingly rich set of themes that push it past the standard story of professional killers. While audiences might initially focus on the gunfights and chases, the film is really concerned with deeper ideas: identity, redemption, loneliness, obsession, aging, and the search for human connection. Through its characters, visual motifs, and structure, the movie asks what happens when people define themselves entirely by their profession, and what's left once that identity starts to crumble. Redemption is one of the film's most important themes. Robert Rat isn't presented as a traditional hero. He's spent years making a living by taking lives, and the story never glosses over the moral weight of that. But he's also shown as a man growing increasingly uneasy with the life he's chosen. aware that his actions have cut him off from ordinary society and left him emotionally drained. His journey throughout the film is essentially a search for redemption, an attempt to escape a world built on violence and death. Unlike most action protagonists chasing victory, revenge, or glory, Rat is chasing peace, and that distinction gives him unusual depth. His goal isn't to become a better assassin, it's to stop being one entirely. This theme comes through most clearly in his relationship with Elektra, who represents the possibility of a life outside the world of assassination. Through his growing concern for her safety, Rat starts to rediscover qualities his profession had buried: compassion, empathy, emotional vulnerability. In a lot of ways, Elektra symbolizes the life he might have had if he'd made different choices. Closely tied to redemption is the theme of identity. Nearly every major character in Assassins wrestles with questions of self-definition. Rat has been an assassin for so long that he barely knows who he is outside that role, and the film keeps asking whether a person can redefine themselves after becoming trapped inside a particular identity. That question sits at the center of the narrative. Rat is trying to separate himself from the reputation that made him famous, even as the world keeps seeing him as a legendary killer. The identity theme gets an even more dramatic treatment through Miguel Bain. Unlike Rat, Bain embraces the assassin identity completely. His entire sense of self is built around becoming the greatest killer alive, and he measures his worth through professional success and recognition. As a result, he becomes psychologically dependent on competition and validation. His obsession with Rat exposes the dangers of building an identity entirely on external validation. He believes killing Rat will finally give his life meaning, but audiences gradually sense that even if he succeeds, the emptiness would remain. The film suggests that an identity based purely on outside approval is ultimately unsustainable. Loneliness runs through the whole movie. Despite their very different personalities, both Rat and Bain are deeply isolated men. Their profession demands secrecy, deception, and emotional distance, and neither one is capable of maintaining normal relationships because their lives revolve around violence and mistrust. Rat's loneliness is quiet and melancholic. He understands exactly what he's sacrificed over the years and carries the weight of it, and his isolation feels almost tragic because he recognizes the consequences but can't easily escape them. Bain's loneliness looks different. He masks it with humor, energy, and constant talking, but underneath the confident exterior is someone deeply isolated, who's replaced genuine relationships with professional competition. His obsession with Rat is partly about wanting connection, even if that connection only comes in the form of rivalry. The film suggests that violence creates distance between people. Both assassins exist outside ordinary human experience, watching society from afar without ever truly taking part in it. Aging and generational conflict also play a significant role. Rat represents experience, discipline, and maturity. Bain represents youth, ambition, and impatience. Their conflict reflects a classic generational struggle, though the film avoids easy conclusions. It doesn't paint either generation as inherently superior, instead examining how different life experiences shape values and behavior. Rat has learned caution through hardship. Bain is still driven by the thrill of possibility because he hasn't yet felt the consequences of his choices. Rat sees something of his younger self in Bain, while Bain sees Rat as both mentor and obstacle, turning their relationship into a symbol of the tension between past and future. Obsession is another central theme. Bain's pursuit of Rat evolves well past professional rivalry into something far more consuming, as he becomes fixated on proving himself superior, a fixation that gradually swallows every part of his thinking. The film treats obsession as a destructive force, rather than bringing satisfaction. Bain's fixation narrows his world until nothing else matters, and his inability to move past that single goal ultimately contributes to his downfall. Through Bain, the story explores how unchecked ambition can turn self-destructive. Several recurring symbols reinforce these themes. Surveillance is one of the most persistent. Characters are constantly watching, tracking, and monitoring each other, and windows, scopes, cameras, and distant vantage points show up again and again. These visual motifs stand in for emotional distance and isolation. Watching becomes a metaphor for the characters' inability to form genuine connections, since they observe others from afar rather than engaging directly. One of the most underrated aspects of Assassins is its visual craftsmanship. While the film is often remembered for the performances of Stallone and Banderas or its cat-and-mouse plot, a lot of its effectiveness comes from how director Richard Donner and his team use cinematography, lighting, composition, and camera movement to build suspense and atmosphere. It doesn't chase the flashy visual experimentation of some later action films, but its careful visual language plays a real role in shaping the audience's experience. At its heart, Assassins is a film about observation. Characters spend much of the story watching, tracking, hunting, and anticipating each other, and the cinematography reflects that constantly. The camera often adopts the perspective of an observer rather than an active participant. Long-distance shots, surveillance-style framing, and compositions built around windows, doorways, and architecture all reinforce the sense that someone is always watching. This approach creates tension even during quiet scenes, encouraging the audience to scan the frame for hidden threats. Much like the assassins themselves, viewers become observers, on the lookout for danger, a technique that sustains suspense without relying on continuous action. The film's cinematography was built to support its psychological conflict just as much as its physical confrontations. Rather than leaning on rapid editing and explosive spectacle, many scenes let tension develop through visual composition, often emphasizing the physical distance between characters, a distance that becomes symbolic of their emotional isolation. Lighting is another major contributor to the movie's atmosphere. Much of Assassins unfolds in spaces lit by artificial light: hotel rooms, apartments, offices, city streets, nighttime locations, creating a world that feels detached from nature and disconnected from ordinary life. Shadows are used especially well. Characters frequently emerge from darkness or vanish into it, reinforcing the secretive nature of their profession. Assassins live in the shadows, both literally and figuratively, and the lighting keeps reminding viewers of that. Rat is often shot with softer, more restrained lighting that emphasizes his exhausted, reflective nature. Shadows partially obscure his face, hinting at a man burdened by memory and regret, and the lighting communicates his psychological state without a word of dialogue needed. Bane, by contrast, is usually framed with brighter, more dynamic lighting and stronger visual contrast, mirroring his chaotic, unpredictable personality. Where Rat appears controlled and introspective, Bane feels erratic, and the cinematography quietly reinforces that difference throughout. Color plays its own role in the film's identity. Assassins leans into the palettes typical of mid-1990s thrillers: muted tones, metallic surfaces, gray cityscapes, and subdued interiors dominate, with bright colors used sparingly so they land harder when they do appear. This restrained palette supports the film's serious tone. The world these characters occupy feels cold and impersonal, and that visual coldness echoes the emotional isolation both Rat and Bane experience. Urban architecture is another key visual element. Large buildings, crowded streets, office complexes, and industrial spaces show up repeatedly, creating a sense of scale that emphasizes just how small the individual characters really are. This architectural choice ties directly into the film's theme of loneliness. Even surrounded by dense city life, the characters remain cut off from meaningful connection, and that contrast between crowded environments and personal isolation becomes one of the film's more powerful visual ideas. Camera movement is used carefully to support tension. Unlike many modern action films built around constant motion, Assassins generally favors controlled, deliberate camera work: slow tracking shots, measured pans, steady framing that lets suspense build gradually. When action does kick in, the camera becomes more dynamic, but Donner mostly avoids visual chaos, keeping audiences oriented in space. That spatial clarity is one of the film's real strengths. A lot of contemporary action movies sacrifice it for rapid editing, but Assassins keeps viewers aware of each scene's geography, which makes the action more engaging because you can actually follow the characters' strategic choices. One especially effective visual technique is framing characters through objects, say windows, mirrors, doorways, scopes, fences. These layered compositions build visual depth while reinforcing the themes of surveillance and separation, reminding viewers that the characters rarely interact directly. Instead, they observe each other from a distance, and those visual barriers often stand in for the emotional ones, keeping them apart. While Assassins is often discussed for its action, performances, and suspenseful plot, its music and sound design are among its most overlooked strengths. Together, they build tension, establish mood, define character relationships, and carry the audience through the story's emotional arc. Director Richard Donner understood that a thriller built around observation, pursuit, and psychological warfare needed more than striking visuals. It needed a soundscape capable of sustaining suspense and pulling viewers into the dangerous world of professional assassins. The score was composed by Mark Mancina, one of the most respected film composers of the 1990s. Mancina had already built a strong reputation on action-oriented projects and would go on to score Speed, Twister, Con Air, Tarzan, and Training Day. His skill at blending traditional orchestral work with modern electronic elements made him a natural fit for a film like Assassins, which sits right at the intersection of classic thriller storytelling and contemporary action cinema. Mancino approached the score with an emphasis on tension rather than non-stop excitement. Rather than blasting the audience with action music from start to finish, he crafted a soundtrack that evolves alongside the story, built largely around anticipation. The music often functions as a quiet warning that danger is approaching, even before the characters themselves know it. A particularly effective choice given how much the narrative revolves around surveillance and hidden threats. Even scenes that seem calm on the surface often carry subtle musical cues suggesting that violence could erupt at any moment. One of the score's most important jobs is distinguishing between the two central assassins. Rat and Bane share a profession, but they're fundamentally different people, and the music reflects that throughout. For Rat, the score leans on more restrained, thoughtful elements that emphasize melancholy, reflection, and emotional fatigue. Musical choices that support a character who isn't energized by his work but burdened by it. The score keeps reminding audiences that beneath his professional competence is a man wrestling with loneliness and regret. Bane gets very different treatment. His scenes often carry more aggressive rhythms, heightened energy, and a greater sense of unpredictability, mirroring a man who thrives on excitement and treats assassination almost like a game. This contrast lets the soundtrack contribute directly to character development. Even without consciously analyzing the music, audiences absorb who these characters are and how they experience the world. The soundtrack's use of silence is also notable. Many thrillers rely on continuous music to sustain tension, but Assassins often shows real restraint. Several key scenes strip away musical accompaniment entirely. In those moments, audiences become acutely aware of small sounds that might otherwise go unnoticed. Footsteps, breathing, distant traffic, the rustle of clothing, the click of a weapon, and that selective silence ramps up tension because viewers instinctively sense something important is about to happen. The sound design is just as impressive. Sound designers built an audio environment that reinforces the film's themes of surveillance and observation, using a wide range of environmental sounds to establish place and atmosphere. Urban noise plays a particularly important role. Traffic, distant sirens, conversation, machinery, elevators, air conditioning, electronic devices, creating a realistic sonic backdrop that reminds viewers the story unfolds within a living world full of ordinary people. most of them unaware of the deadly conflict happening around them. That contrast between everyday sound and extraordinary danger heightens the suspense. These assassins aren't operating on isolated battlefields but moving through ordinary environments where violence can erupt out of nowhere. Weapons get special sonic attention throughout, given that the story revolves around professional killers. Every click, reload, chambering motion, and gunshot is carefully crafted for maximum dramatic impact. The film never treats weapons as simple action props, instead making their sound part of the storytelling itself. Audiences learn to associate specific sounds with danger, preparation, and anticipation. A weapon being loaded can generate nearly as much tension as the confrontation that follows. The way sound represents distance is another strong element. Since so much of the story centers on observation and pursuit, the filmmakers frequently use audio to convey spatial relationships, say sounds appearing distant, muffled, or partially obscured depending on where a character stands. This builds immersion while reinforcing the surveillance theme. Characters are constantly trying to locate one another, and sound becomes a key tool for understanding their surroundings, an experience the audience often shares as they listen for clues about hidden danger. When Assassins arrived in 1995, expectations were high. The film combined a number of elements that seemed to guarantee success: a major studio production, acclaimed director Richard Donner, the star power of Sylvester Stallone, Antonio Banderas' rising popularity, and a screenplay that had generated real buzz during development. On paper, it had everything needed to become one of the decade's defining action thrillers. In practice, the reception was more complicated. Audiences generally found it entertaining, but critics were split, and the film ended up somewhere between blockbuster success and critical letdown. At the box office, Assassins did reasonably well but never became the major hit many industry observers had expected. Releasing during a competitive stretch for Hollywood action films, it faced real pressure from other high-profile releases, and while it earned respectable revenue worldwide, it didn't rank among the year's biggest successes. For Stallone specifically, this mattered because it came at a moment when Hollywood was starting to question whether traditional action stars could keep drawing audiences the way they had through the 80s and early 90s. Many critics viewed Assassins through that lens, as some saw it as evidence the classic action formula was losing steam, while others argued it represented a sincere attempt to evolve the genre by adding more character depth and psychological complexity. That disagreement shaped much of the mixed critical response. Pacing was one of the most common criticisms. Several reviewers felt the story moved too slowly for an action thriller rather than delivering non-stop action. Donner chose to emphasize suspense, surveillance, and character interaction. Some critics appreciated that choice, others felt it drained the excitement audiences expect from a film built around two professional assassins, arguing the movie spent too much time building tension and not enough delivering action set pieces, and that fans expecting a traditional Stallone vehicle might come away disappointed. On the other hand, plenty of critics praised the film's focus on character psychology, arguing the slower pace let audiences actually understand what drove the central characters emotionally, rather than treating the assassins as simple action figures. Performances drew some of the strongest praise overall. Antonio Banderas, in particular, stood out. Even critics who disliked the film often singled out his portrayal of Miguel Bain as one of its biggest strengths, describing him as energetic, charismatic, and unpredictable, and noting how effectively he balanced humor and menace to create a villain who was both entertaining and genuinely threatening. For many viewers, Banderas became the most memorable part of the whole film, and his performance remains one of the most frequently discussed aspects of Assassins today, as some critics even suggested he outshines Stallone in several scenes purely through sheer screen presence. Stallone's own performance drew a more mixed reaction. Some reviewers appreciated his attempt at a more reflective, emotionally complex character, seeing Rat as a refreshing break from the invincible action heroes that had defined much of his career. Others felt the role held back some of the qualities that made him such a popular star, and audiences used to the explosive energy of Rocky Balboa or John Rambo sometimes found Rat's quiet, introspective nature less immediately engaging. Over time, though, critical opinion has warmed considerably. Modern reassessments often note that Rat anticipated the aging, reflective heroes Stallone would go on to play in Rocky Balboa, Creed, and Rambo, and what once read as low energy is now frequently seen as a deliberate character choice. Julianne Moore's performance was generally well received. Critics praised her ability to bring intelligence and credibility to Elektra, and although the character easily could have been reduced to a stock supporting role, Moore gave her real emotional depth and individuality. Several reviewers noted that she provided an important human element within a story dominated by killers, and that her scenes with Rat helped ground the narrative emotionally, giving audiences a reason to invest in his search for redemption. Richard Donner's direction was another major point of discussion. Many critics acknowledged his professionalism and technical skill. The action sequences were generally considered well staged, and his visual storytelling earned praise from reviewers who appreciated traditional filmmaking craft. Some critics, though, felt his style read as a bit old-fashioned against emerging trends in action cinema, arguing that by the mid-1990s audiences were increasingly used to faster editing and more aggressive visual approaches, and that Assassins leaned too heavily on conventions from the previous decade. The screenplay drew its own share of debate. Some reviewers felt the dialogue occasionally slipped into familiar action movie territory and that certain plot developments were predictable, while others argued the story's psychological depth more than made up for those weaknesses. A film's real significance is often measured less by its opening weekend than by the influence it exerts years, even decades, later. Assassins wasn't seen as a groundbreaking blockbuster in 1995, but its legacy has grown steadily since. It occupies a unique spot in the history of action thrillers, both a reflection of the genre's past and a preview of where it was headed. Through its characters, themes, performances, and storytelling, the film has left a mark that extends well beyond its box office numbers or contemporary reviews. One of the more significant parts of that legacy is its contribution to the evolution of the professional assassin genre. Before Assassins, most assassin-centered stories focused mainly on action and espionage, presenting killers as highly skilled but emotionally distant figures whose inner lives got little attention. Assassins helped push the genre toward a more character-driven approach by exploring the psychological toll of a life built around violence. Robert Rat isn't just an efficient killer, he's a man suffering from emotional exhaustion, loneliness, and regret, and his story is as much about redemption and self-discovery as it is about action. That approach became increasingly common in later films about aging or morally conflicted assassins. In hindsight, echoes of Rat's character show up in later protagonists like John Wyck, Robert McCall from the Equalizer series, and various retired operatives pulled back into dangerous work. Assassins certainly didn't invent these ideas, but it helped popularize them within mainstream action cinema. The relationship between Rat and Bane also left a lasting mark on later thrillers. Rather than a straightforward hero versus villain setup, the film centers on a rivalry between two professionals representing different stages of the same life path. The older assassin seeking peace and escape, the younger one chasing recognition and dominance. That dynamic has since shown up in countless action films and TV shows. The idea of an experienced veteran facing off against an ambitious successor became a recurring structure within the genre, one audiences respond to because it combines physical conflict with deeper questions about identity, legacy, and generational change. Banderas' portrayal of Bane is another important part of the film's legacy. Although not his first Hollywood role, it was one of the performances that helped establish him as a major international star. His energetic, unpredictable villain challenged a lot of the conventions tied to action movie antagonists. Say before Bane, most villains in the genre were defined by cold efficiency or physical intimidation, but Banderas introduced a different kind of threat: charismatic, talkative, emotionally expressive, and often funny. That blend of charm and danger made him memorable and helped shape later portrayals of psychologically unstable antagonists. A lot of modern action villains share qualities Bane helped popularize: a highly intelligent, emotionally volatile, driven by personal obsessions rather than purely financial or political motives. His success proved audiences could be captivated by villains who were entertaining as well as threatening. The film also occupies an interesting place in the careers of its stars. For Stallone, Assassins was one of several 1990s projects that explored more introspective characters, hinting at the reflective roles he'd embrace more fully later on. Looking back, Rat feels remarkably similar to some of Stallone's most acclaimed later performances, as the older Rocky Balboa and the aging Rambo share the same themes of regret, aging, and searching for meaning. In that sense, Assassins can be seen as an early chapter in the evolution of Stallone's more mature screen persona. Julianne Moore's involvement adds to the film's historical significance too. She was still building her reputation at the time, and as her career flourished, audiences revisiting Assassins gained a new appreciation for her work. Today, the film stands as an interesting early example of Moore's talent before she became one of the most celebrated performers in modern cinema. Another major piece of the film's legacy is its screenplay's connection to Lana Wachowski and Lily Wachowski. Assassins remains one of their most frequently discussed early projects. Say years before creating The Matrix, they wrote the original script that eventually became this film. The final movie differs significantly from their original draft, but it remains an important part of their professional history, and film scholars often examine Assassins when tracing the development of ideas that would later show up in the Wachowskis' work. The screenplay's messy production history has become a fascinating case study for anyone interested in how Hollywood development actually works. The film's connection to Richard Donner further cements his legacy. He was one of the defining filmmakers of modern action cinema, and Assassins represents one of the later entries in an impressive career. It may not rank among his most famous work, but it still demonstrates the qualities that made him successful: a strong character relationships, clear visual storytelling, effective suspense, and a commitment to practical filmmaking. One of the more interesting things about Assassins is how audience perceptions have shifted over time. When it first came out in 1995, many viewers approached it primarily as a star-driven action thriller, expecting explosive sequences, intense confrontations, and the kind of larger-than-life heroics associated with Stallone. The film delivered its share of action and suspense, but plenty of viewers eventually discovered its most compelling qualities were beneath the surface. Over the years, different generations of audiences have interpreted the film in their own ways, often finding deeper meaning in its themes of aging, identity, loneliness, obsession, and redemption. For audiences in the mid-1990s, Assassins arrived during a period of real change in popular cinema. The action genre was evolving, and viewers were getting used to films that put more weight on character psychology. But plenty of moviegoers still associated action stars with straightforward heroism and physical dominance. Some viewers felt a disconnect between their expectations and what the film actually delivered. Instead of an invincible warrior, Rat is presented as a tired, emotionally exhausted man looking for a way out of his profession. Some found that quieter, more introspective approach refreshing. Others found it unusual compared to the action films they were used to. Viewers who connected with the film often responded strongly to Rat's emotional journey, recognizing that beneath the action narrative was a universal story about reaching a turning point in life. His desire to leave behind a world that no longer fulfills him resonates with people who felt something similar in their own careers or personal lives, a theme that's become especially meaningful for older audiences. many of whom relate more closely to Rat as they age themselves. What might have initially seemed like a simple action hero role often reveals itself, on reflection, as a meditation on burnout, regret, and the search for purpose. Rat's struggle with aging is especially powerful. He isn't just fighting external enemies but confronting the reality that time has changed him, that he can no longer approach life with the same certainty or enthusiasm he once had. Many viewers who've been through major life transitions recognize that same emotional conflict. The film's portrayal of loneliness resonates just as deeply. Despite being surrounded by people, Rat exists in a state of real isolation, having spent so much of his life hiding his true self that he no longer knows how to form meaningful connections, a feeling many people understand regardless of their profession or background. Modern audiences often single out loneliness as one of the film's most relatable themes, especially in an increasingly connected world where isolation and disconnection remain surprisingly common. Miguel Bain produces a very different kind of audience response. On original release, many viewers found him entertaining thanks to his energy, humor, and unpredictability. Banderas brought a charisma to the role that made him hard to ignore. But as audiences revisit the film, many start noticing deeper layers beneath that confidence. Someone desperately seeking validation and recognition. Bain builds his entire identity around competition and achievement, believing that becoming the world's greatest assassin will finally give his life meaning. A lot of viewers see him as a representation of unhealthy ambition, his obsession with surpassing Rat reflecting a mindset that prizes achievement above all else, something audiences often recognize in contemporary society, where success and status can end up substituting for genuine fulfillment. His popularity has actually grown over time. While a lot of villains fade from memory, Bain keeps drawing attention because he combines entertainment value with real psychological complexity. Many fans consider him one of the most memorable action antagonists of the 1990s. Audience interpretations of the Rat-Bain relationship have evolved too. Early on, many viewers saw their conflict as a simple hero versus villain battle, but over time more nuanced readings have emerged. Some audiences now interpret Bain as a younger version of what Rat once was, the two men representing different stages of the same life path, with Rat living out the consequences of a lifetime of violence while Bain remains intoxicated by the thrill of power and competition. That reading turns their rivalry into something deeper than a professional conflict, a symbolic confrontation between past and future, experience and ambition, wisdom and recklessness. A lot of viewers find this interpretation especially compelling because it adds real emotional weight to their scenes together. Elektra's role adds another layer to how audiences engage with the film. For many viewers, she represents hope and human connection, reminding Rat that a different kind of life is possible. Rather than functioning solely as a plot device, she works as a symbol of redemption and emotional renewal. Audiences often focus on how she reshapes Rat's priorities, watching him gradually rediscover aspects of his humanity buried under years of violence and isolation. That transformation is one of the film's most emotionally satisfying elements. Generational differences shape how audiences read the film too. Viewers who experienced it during its original theatrical run often remember it in the context of 1990s action cinema, comparing it to other thrillers of the era. Younger audiences, having grown up with modern action franchises and highly stylized choreography, tend to focus more on the story's psychological aspects, and many are surprised by just how character-driven the film feels. One of Assassin's greatest strengths is its focus on character development. Although structured as an action thriller full of suspense, pursuit, and violence, the true heart of the story lies in the personal journeys of its central characters. Robert Rat, Miguel Bain, and Elektra each go through significant emotional and psychological changes, and their individual arcs weave together into a story about identity, purpose, redemption, obsession, and human connection. Looking at how these characters change and how they change each other helps explain why the film stays compelling long after its action sequences end. At the center stands Robert Wright, played by Sylvester Stallone, whose arc forms the emotional foundation of the entire film. When audiences first meet him, he's already one of the most successful assassins alive. Unlike most action protagonists chasing glory or excitement, Wright is exhausted by the life he's built. Years of violence have left him emotionally detached and spiritually drained. From the start, he's a man in crisis, still highly skilled at his profession, but no longer finding any satisfaction in it, carrying the weight of countless assignments while feeling increasingly disconnected from the world around him. His professionalism stays intact, but his sense of purpose has vanished. That internal conflict is the foundation of his arc, which isn't about becoming stronger or more capable, it's about rediscovering his humanity. He begins the story believing his past choices have permanently defined him, but as the narrative unfolds, he gradually learns that change is still possible. One of the most important parts of Wright's development is his growing awareness of everything his profession has cost him. It's brought him financial success and a fearsome reputation, but also robbed him of meaningful relationships and emotional fulfillment. Elektra's arrival accelerates that realization. Through their interactions, Wright starts reconnecting with emotions he's suppressed for years, beginning to care about someone else's future rather than focusing purely on his own survival. It's a subtle shift compared to the film's action sequences, but it represents a profound change in his character. By the end of the story, Wright is no longer driven purely by professional obligation or self-preservation. He's rediscovered the desire to actually live rather than just exist. His arc traces a path from emotional isolation to connection and redemption. Many viewers read Wright as a man seeking forgiveness, not necessarily from others, but from himself, and his development suggests that redemption isn't achieved through one heroic act, but through a willingness to embrace change and pursue something better. Miguel Bain, played by Antonio Banderas, moves in the opposite direction. While Wright seeks escape from violence, Bain becomes increasingly consumed by it. When he first appears, he's energetic, confident, and ambitious, viewing assassination as a path to recognition and success. Unlike Wright, who's grown weary of the profession, Bain is genuinely excited by it, believing that becoming the world's greatest assassin will finally give his life meaning. At first glance he seems almost playful. His humor, charisma, and enthusiasm make him fun to watch, but as the story unfolds, audiences start to see the deeper insecurities driving his behavior. His obsession with Wright sits at the center of that development. He doesn't just want to outperform another assassin, he wants validation, believing that beating Wright will finally prove his worth. A need for recognition that reveals real insecurity beneath his confident surface. As the story progresses, that fixation becomes increasingly unhealthy. His professional ambitions turn into a personal obsession, and he starts making decisions based on his emotional need to defeat Wright rather than practical considerations. A transformation that illustrates one of the film's core themes: the danger of building an identity entirely around achievement. Bain's self-worth depends on external validation, trapping him in a cycle of competition and obsession. Unlike Wright, whose emotional world gradually expands through his connection with Elektra, Bain's world keeps narrowing, his fixation on Wright eventually swallowing every part of his thinking. Audiences watch ambition curdle into self-destruction. What makes Bain such a compelling character is that his motivations stay understandable even as his actions grow more extreme. Viewers may not approve of his choices, but they can recognize the emotional needs behind them, which elevates him well beyond a conventional action movie villain. The relationship between Wright and Bain is really the emotional engine of the film. On the surface, they're adversaries. Underneath, there's a fascinating psychological connection. Many viewers read Bain as a reflection of Wright's younger self. Both men possess extraordinary skill and built their identities around the same profession, but where Wright has lived through the consequences of that life, Bane remains captivated by its possibilities. It's a strange kind of mentorship through opposition. Rat never intentionally teaches Bane anything, but his very existence shapes Bane's ambitions, and Bane, in turn, forces Rat to confront parts of himself he'd rather leave behind. Their rivalry becomes symbolic of a much larger conflict: experience versus ambition, wisdom versus recklessness, maturity versus youth, with each man representing a possible future for the other. Rat sees what he once was, Bane sees what he hopes to become. Elektra serves a very different narrative function. While Rat and Bane embody opposing approaches to violence, she represents an entirely different path: the possibility of a normal life built on trust, connection, and emotional honesty. At the start of the story, she's mainly concerned with her own survival, caught in circumstances beyond her control and forced to navigate a dangerous world full of professional killers. Although Assassins is best remembered for its suspenseful story, memorable performances, and action, its costume and set design play a real part in establishing atmosphere and reinforcing its themes. Every piece of clothing, every location, and every visual detail contributes to how the audience understands the characters and the world they move through. The film's designers built an environment that feels realistic, dangerous, and emotionally isolated, a perfect reflection of professional assassins living on the margins of society. Through wardrobe, architecture, interior design, props, and visual environment, Assassins treats design as a genuine storytelling tool. One of the more striking things about the costume design is its emphasis on practicality. Unlike a lot of action films that go for exaggerated or highly stylized wardrobes, Assassins grounds its characters in realistic clothing that reflects who they are and what they do, helping build a believable world where deadly people can move unnoticed through ordinary society. Rat's wardrobe is a perfect example. For most of the film, he wears understated clothing designed to draw as little attention as possible: dark jackets, neutral colors, simple shirts, practical trousers. Nothing about his appearance suggests he's one of the world's most skilled assassins, and that's exactly the point. His clothing reflects both his profession and personality: disciplined, cautious, and deeply experienced. He understands that survival depends on staying invisible, and his wardrobe lets him blend into his surroundings instead of standing out. The color choices matter too: dark blues, grays, blacks, and muted earth tones dominate his wardrobe, reinforcing his emotional state as a man carrying the weight of his past, defined by caution, secrecy, and isolation. His clothing also hints at a desire to disappear entirely. Unlike younger or flashier characters, he has no interest in drawing attention to himself, and the simplicity of his look mirrors his growing wish to leave his profession behind and fade into a normal life. Bane's costume design creates a dramatic contrast while staying grounded in realism. His clothing tends to feel more expressive and energetic. He carries himself with confidence and enjoys being noticed, and his wardrobe reflects that. He still wears practical clothing suited to an assassin, but there's more style and personality in his appearance than in Rat's. His outfits help communicate his youth, ambition, and confidence, and unlike Rat, who wants to stay invisible, Bane seems to enjoy the performance side of his profession. That contrast matters. It visually reinforces the two men's opposing philosophies before either even speaks. Rat treats assassination as a burden, Bane treats it as an opportunity. Banderas' natural charisma only strengthens the effect, with the costume design supporting a character who thrives on attention and excitement. Elektra's costume design serves a different purpose entirely, reflecting her status as an ordinary person swept into extraordinary circumstances. Unlike the assassins, she's not trained to navigate a world of violence and deception. Early in the film, her wardrobe feels practical and contemporary, reflecting the life of a working professional. But as danger escalates, her appearance subtly shifts to reflect the stress and uncertainty she's experiencing, a visual way of illustrating how dramatically her life has been upended. By the end, Audiences can see evidence of everything she's been through, not just in her actions but in how she looks. Beyond the costumes, the film's set design contributes enormously to its atmosphere. One of the movie's most important visual themes is isolation, and the environments constantly reinforce that idea. Many of the locations are surprisingly impersonal: hotels, office buildings, apartments, warehouses, parking structures, anonymous urban spaces, all feeling temporary and interchangeable, reflecting the transient lives of the characters who move through them. Rat's living spaces are particularly telling, his apartments and temporary residences feel functional rather than personal, containing only what's necessary to survive, with little evidence of hobbies, personal interests, or emotional attachments. That design choice tells the audience a great deal about him without a word of dialogue. He's spent so much of his life bouncing between assignments that he's never built a true home, and his living spaces feel more like shelters than places of belonging. The absence of personal touches reinforces the loneliness at the center of his character Ray. He occupies these spaces without ever truly inhabiting them emotionally. Bane's environments reveal a different side of him. Although he moves through many of the same urban settings, his presence often brings extra energy to wherever he goes, and the way he interacts with a space reflects his more aggressive, theatrical nature. Where Rat moves carefully and efficiently, Bane seems more comfortable treating the world as a stage. The same locations feel different depending on which character occupies them. The urban settings themselves function almost like characters in their own right. Large cities offer the perfect backdrop for a story about professional assassins. Crowded streets, towering buildings, busy intersections, and anonymous public spaces let people hide in plain sight. This kind of setting supports one of the film's central themes: isolation within a populated world. The characters are constantly surrounded by people while remaining emotionally disconnected from them, and the city becomes a visual symbol of modern loneliness. The screenplay of Assassins holds a fascinating place in the film's overall legacy. Audiences often remember the movie for its performances, action, and psychological rivalry, but a lot of its effectiveness traces back to the script itself. The dialogue and narrative construction help turn what could have been a straightforward action thriller into a character-driven story about identity, obsession, redemption, and human connection. Through its conversations, monologues, confrontations, and carefully structured scenes, the screenplay lays the foundation the entire film is built on. One of the most interesting things about the script is how much it prioritizes character over spectacle. Even though Assassins has its share of action sequences and suspenseful set pieces, the screenplay consistently focuses on the emotional and psychological journeys of its central characters, often expressing the story's most important conflicts through dialogue rather than gunfire. That emphasis lets audiences understand not just what the characters are doing, but why the script recognizes that suspense becomes far more compelling when viewers understand the motivations behind it. Rat's dialogue reflects his personality and emotional state throughout. He's a man who's spent years operating in secrecy, and his speech patterns show it. He speaks carefully and economically, rarely wasting words, often communicating more through silence than through lengthy explanation. That restraint is one of the screenplay's real strengths. Rather than leaning on constant exposition, the script lets his personality emerge gradually through his interactions with others. His dialogue carries professionalism, intelligence, caution, and emotional fatigue, with an undercurrent of regret running through even the most practical conversations. Audiences can sense the weight he's carrying without the film ever spelling it out directly. Instead, it emerges naturally through how he responds to people and situations. That subtlety makes the character more believable. Real people rarely announce their emotional struggles outright. They reveal them through behavior, tone, and small choices, and the script captures that reality well. Bane sits at the opposite end of the dialogue spectrum. Where Rat is restrained, Bane is expressive. Where Rat speaks only when necessary, Bane talks for the sheer pleasure of hearing himself do it. Banderas' performance benefits enormously from how the screenplay handles Bane. His dialogue is energetic, theatrical, and often funny, treating conversation almost like performance, using words to provoke, entertain, and manipulate. The contrast between the two men produces some of the film's most memorable exchanges, with their conversations functioning as ideological battles just as much as practical discussions, each interaction revealing their differing philosophies and personalities. Bane's constant talking also serves a real narrative purpose. It offers a window into his psychological state, since his need to keep talking reflects a deeper need for recognition and validation. He wants to be noticed, remembered, acknowledged as superior, and that trait makes him a uniquely engaging antagonist. A lot of action villains rely on intimidation or mystery. Bane relies on personality, and the screenplay lets him dominate scenes through language as effectively as through physical action. Another strength of the script is its use of tension-building dialogue. Many conversations in Assassins operate on more than one level at once, with characters discussing one subject while implying another, a particularly effective technique given how much the story revolves around deception, surveillance, and hidden intentions. Few characters say exactly what they mean. Instead, conversations become strategic encounters where information is carefully controlled, and audiences are frequently required to read between the lines, which pulls viewers into the storytelling process as active participants interpreting subtext. Elektra's dialogue serves a different function in the narrative. Unlike Rat and Bane, she exists outside the professional assassin world, so her conversations often offer an alternative perspective on events. Her dialogue humanizes the story while Rat and Bane discuss survival, strategy, and professional reputation. Elektra's conversations introduce themes of trust, vulnerability, and emotional connection. The screenplay carefully develops her relationship with Rat through dialogue that evolves gradually over time. Their early interactions are cautious and uncertain, and trust builds slowly, which helps the audience believe in their growing connection. It's one of the script's most effective qualities. Rather than forcing emotional development, it lets relationships emerge naturally out of shared experience and mutual dependence. The script also shows a strong sense of pacing. Dialogue-heavy scenes are strategically placed between action sequences, creating a rhythm that keeps audiences engaged without wearing them out. These quieter moments serve several purposes. They build character, let tension develop, and give viewers time to absorb important information. The screenplay understands that suspense often lands harder when balanced against periods of relative calm. Humor is another important ingredient in the dialogue. Assassins is fundamentally a serious thriller, but the script includes moments of levity that keep the story from becoming emotionally exhausting. Most of that humor comes through Bane. His confidence, eccentric behavior, and exaggerated reactions create plenty of entertaining moments, but the humor never really undermines the suspense. If anything, it enhances his unpredictability, making him even more dangerous, since audiences never quite know whether he'll respond to a situation with violence, amusement, or some mix of both. That uncertainty contributes significantly to how well the character works. The marketing campaign for Assassins reflected the changing landscape of Hollywood in the mid-1990s. By the time it was released in 1995, the movie industry had grown increasingly dependent on global marketing strategies, recognizable stars, and high-concept advertising built to grab audiences quickly. Studios understood that opening weekends mattered more than ever, and major action films needed strong promotional pushes to stand out in an increasingly crowded marketplace. Assassins benefited from the involvement of several well-known industry figures, and much of its marketing framed the film as a high-stakes confrontation between two dangerous professionals played by charismatic international stars. Sylvester Stallone was one of the studio's biggest promotional assets. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, he'd become one of the most recognizable movie stars on the planet, and his name alone could pull in audience attention. Films like Rocky, First Blood, Rambo, First Blood Part 2, Cobra, Cliffhanger, Demolition Man, and Judge Dredd had established him as one of Hollywood's premier action heroes. So much of the early advertising for Assassins leaned on Stallone's involvement. Tape posters, trailers, magazine ads, and TV spots frequently featured his image and reputation. The marketing presented Robert Trout as another dangerous character in the tradition of Stallone's most famous roles, while also hinting at the film's darker, more mature themes. That created an interesting challenge, though. Rat wasn't a typical Stallone hero. Unlike Rocky Balboa or John Rambo, he wasn't motivated by victory, patriotism, or revenge, but was instead an aging professional killer seeking redemption and escape. The marketing team had to balance traditional action movie expectations against the film's more introspective qualities, and they mostly did that by focusing promotional materials on suspense and rivalry rather than emotional complexity, inviting audiences to watch a battle between legendary assassins rather than a meditation on aging and identity, an approach that made the film easier to sell to mainstream action audiences. Antonio Banderas was another major piece of the campaign. He hadn't yet reached the level of international fame he'd achieve later, but he was quickly becoming one of Hollywood's most exciting emerging stars, and his charisma and growing popularity gave the studio an extra promotional edge. A lot of the advertising leaned on the conflict between Stallone and Banderas, framing the movie as a deadly game between two elite opponents, a rivalry that became the campaign's central selling point, with promotional materials frequently emphasizing the contrast between the experienced veteran and the ambitious challenger. That strategy worked because audiences naturally gravitate towards strong rivalries, and the idea of two elite assassins hunting each other gave the studio a simple, compelling premise that could be communicated quickly through trailers and posters. The theatrical poster remains one of the most recognizable pieces of the film's marketing. Its design put the lead actors' faces front and center, immediately signaling that this was a star-driven movie, while images of weapons, dramatic lighting, and intense expressions reinforced the thriller elements. Like a lot of action movie posters from the era, it relied on recognizable faces rather than complicated imagery, a reflection of a broader marketing trend throughout the 90s, when studios understood that a lot of viewing decisions came down to actors audiences already knew and trusted. The trailers played a particularly important role in shaping expectations. The marketing team carefully chose scenes that highlighted suspense, action, and the escalating rivalry between Rat and Bane, using quick editing, dramatic music, and memorable confrontations to build excitement. One notable aspect was how much they leaned on Miguel Bane's unpredictable personality. Banderas's energetic performance translated exceptionally well to promotional material, and his enthusiasm, humor, and intensity grabbed attention immediately, making him one of the campaign's most valuable assets. The trailers also emphasized the story's cat-and-mouse structure, presenting the idea that neither assassin held a permanent advantage, an uncertainty that generated real intrigue and encouraged viewers to find out how the conflict would resolve. Television advertising was another major component of the campaign. In the mid-1990s, TV remained one of the most powerful marketing platforms available to studios, and short commercials ran during popular programs, sporting events, and primetime broadcasts, typically condensing the film's premise into 30-second or 1-minute spots packed with explosions, gunfire, dramatic dialogue, and glimpses of the lead actors. Print advertising mattered just as much. Movie magazines, entertainment publications, newspapers, and industry journals all ran ads promoting the film, and interviews with cast and crew added to the buzz. Stallone took part in promotional appearances and press interviews meant to build interest in the project, with journalists often focusing on how the role differed from his previous action heroes and highlighting the character's more mature qualities. Banderas also became a significant focus of media attention. his rising profile drawing curiosity from audiences and many interviews emphasizing his experience working alongside established Hollywood veterans, appearances that helped introduce him to viewers who might not have known his earlier work. Julianne Moore's involvement got less attention during the original campaign than it might today. At the time, she was still building her reputation as one of Hollywood's finest actresses, and while modern audiences often view her presence as one of the film's real strengths, the original promotion focused mainly on the rivalry between the two male leads. To really appreciate Assassins, it helps to compare it with other films in the action and thriller genres, along with the broader work of its director and lead actors. Those comparisons reveal both the film's strengths and why it occupies such a distinct place within 1990s cinema. Assassins never achieved the legendary status of some of its contemporaries, but it stands out for its focus on character psychology, its exploration of aging and identity, and its unusual balance between action spectacle and emotional introspection. One obvious point of comparison is Stallone's other action films. Through the 80s and early 90s, he became famous for playing larger-than-life heroes, characters like Rocky Balboa and John Rambo, defined by determination, physical endurance, and a willingness to overcome impossible odds. In films like Rambo, First Blood Part 2 and Cobra, his characters often represented unstoppable forces up against external threats, facing mostly physical challenges as they battled enemies, survived dangerous situations, and emerged victorious through strength and perseverance. Robert Wright is fundamentally different. He has the same professional competence audiences expect from a Stallone character, but his real conflict is internal, not external. He isn't chasing victory over an enemy, he's chasing escape from his own past. That distinction makes Assassins more reflective than most of Stallone's earlier action films. Wright's emotional exhaustion, loneliness, and desire for redemption anticipate themes Stallone would explore more fully in later projects like Copland, Rocky Balboa, Creed, and the 2008 Rambo. In a lot of ways, Assassins acts as a bridge between the action-oriented Stallone of the 1980s and the more mature dramatic performer audiences would come to appreciate later. The film shows real evolution, both in the actor's career and in the kinds of stories he wanted to tell. Demolition Man, released 2 years earlier, offers another useful comparison. Both films feature Stallone as a highly skilled professional navigating dangerous situations, but Demolition Man leans into humor, satire, and futuristic spectacle, while Assassins takes a far more serious, grounded tone. The contrast highlights just how versatile Stallone's screen presence really is. In Demolition Man he's a traditional action hero, while in Assassins he becomes a flawed, vulnerable man wrestling with existential questions. Banderas' Miguel Bain also invites comparison with other memorable action villains of the era. Through the 80s and 90s, action cinema produced plenty of iconic antagonists, often defined by physical intimidation, military power, or criminal ambition. Bain stands apart because his greatest weapon is his personality. He's energetic, charismatic, humorous, and emotionally unpredictable rather than relying purely on physical threat, generating tension through psychological instability instead. That approach makes him more comparable to certain later villains than to a lot of his contemporaries, and modern audiences often notice similarities between Bain and the increasingly complex antagonists that became common in 21st century action cinema. His obsession with Wright also sets him apart from more traditional villains. He isn't primarily driven by money, ideology, or revenge, but by a need for validation and recognition, which gives him unusual depth and makes him one of the more memorable antagonists of his era. Comparisons with later assassin-centered films are especially revealing. When Assassins came out, the professional assassin genre was still developing. Earlier films had touched on similar ideas, but the genre hadn't yet reached the popularity it would achieve in later decades. Today, audiences frequently compare Assassins to films like John Wick, The Equalizer, Collateral, and The Mechanic. These movies differ in style and execution, but they share certain thematic concerns.